All right, welcome everyone to class number 10 on Pluto, streaming to you live from Church of Light headquarters in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It's bittersweet. I had someone in the room here moaning because this was the last class tonight. Of course, I had a joyous look on my face. The thought that I get a 3-week break. I do invite all of you to come back April 15th through May 13th, when we will have a 5-week course on the Hermetic system of progressions, where we will be looking at the system of major progressions, minors, and transits. Basically, when and what events happen in your life. And this is actually a really fascinating process in which we will incorporate the individual's chart as part of the study. And we will be incorporating the chart of some famous persons as well, where we can actually track their events as they unfold in the news. For that process, those of you out there that are planning to attend that class, if you actually own the Paul Brewer's horoscope program, then you can run off your chart and progressions at home. If you do not have that, you will need to provide me prior to the beginning of that class with your birth data, and also permission as to whether or not your chart can be used in class and flashed up on the screen as we answer your questions over the internet about a progression that may be going on in your chart. So I want this to be a very interactive class and something that we all learn and get benefit from. I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end of class tonight. There was also an excellent question that came in. I believe the name was Mike Salter prior to class beginning. Mike is viewing this course from somewhere in England. And the reason I think it's an excellent question, Mike, is because it's something I ponder all the time, which is, how does one determine passivity or activity in a chart with each of the planets? When are we a victim to experiences, and when are we perpetrators of experiences? And his question was specifically in relationship to Pluto, is basically, how do you know from Pluto in your chart when you're the victim of coercion or when you're the perpetrator of such? Or is it both? For which I do not have a clear answer, but I thought I'd start the class off with that question. It's something I ponder. I have not determined a way yet of viewing a chart and deciding from an aspect whether it represents passivity or activity, which is basically, are you making events happen or are events happening to you? In general, one of the first principles in looking at a chart is we analyze the placement of planets, whether they fall on the eastern or western half of the chart. Planets on the eastern side of the chart, which are basically houses 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, and 3, if the predominance of your planets is in the eastern hemisphere of your chart, it tends to indicate an individual who is at cause in their life and therefore makes things happen, what we might call the perpetrator. Then the other generality is, if the opposite is true, the majority of your planets fall in the western hemisphere, houses 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, the individual tends to be more at the effect of events in their lives, or I hate to use the word victim, but recipient might be a good word to use. That's one generality. But I'm not clear. Thank you. I'm not clear precisely when this is a case by progression, when something is happening to us or when we are making something happen. And I think maybe in our progressions class, looking at actual case histories, it'll be interesting to look at aspects, look at individuals' charts, both notables and persons participating in the workshop, and see if there is a parallel between Eastern and Western charts, and possibly temporary periods in one's life where they affect change or they're the recipients of change. So there's my long-winded answer for your short question, Mike.
Do you think factors like whether you, like fire signs would tend to be more the perpetrator, using that terminology?
Well, I would assume East and West, that fire and air is more active and that earth and water is more passive. But again, we all go through our days of activity, both doing things and being the recipient. It's like a conversation. When I'm talking, you're passive and hopefully you're listening. And vice versa. We could always hope when you're talking that I'm actually listening. An active listener, yes. Or sometimes a passive listener. But in a conversation that takes place, and our daily activities are like conversations. Sometimes we are doing things. We may do the dishes. We don't say the dishes do us. We go through periods of activity, and then we go through periods of receiving things. So yes, it could be tied into positive, negative signs. It could be tied into the polarity in a chart. I've never really had a clear understanding of how that works, but I, like many of you out there, have thought about that consistently. All right, let's move on. As I say every week, those of you who are attending the class online, thank you for your donations. Some came in today, for which we're very grateful. And you can download the handouts for this class by going to the right hand of your screen. If your viewer is in the minimized position, at the bottom of that list of classes, class number 10 for tonight, there is an icon to download a PDF file. You will follow along with the charts much more easily and the notes more easily than they can be viewed via the internet off the PowerPoint presentation. So please do that and follow along with your notes in hand. One of my favorite writers, Mark Twain or Samuel Clemens. And I like to pick a quote for the beginning of each class that for me represents at least one of the facets or the essence of the topic to be discussed. Since tonight is about Pluto, I've chosen the higher energy of Pluto, which is the universal brotherhood of man is our most precious possession. Mark Twain. Ninth planet from the sun, Pluto is named for the Roman god of the underworld. The smallest of the planets, Pluto is smaller than Earth's moon and half the width of Jupiter's moon, Ganymede. Pluto is the ninth and smallest planet. Pluto was discovered by accident. Oh, here's a great illustration, Pluto compared to the size of the Earth, just to give you an idea. Pluto was discovered by accident in 1930 by Clyde W. Tombaugh at Lowell Observatory in Arizona. Calculations based on the motions of Uranus and Neptune, which later turned out to be an error, had predicted a planet beyond Neptune, often referred to as Planet X. A very careful survey of the sky revealed Pluto. Pluto is the only planet in the solar system which has not been explored by any space probe. Pluto has one moon, Charon. This moon is not much smaller than Pluto itself. No moon is as close to the size of its planet as Charon is to Pluto. This has led some to speculation that Pluto Chiron is a binary planet system. There's something grammatically wrong with this sentence. It was included between speculation and the.
And Pluto, we'll take out the.
That
Pluto is shown,
Yeah.
is a binary.
Thank you. That instead of the. Pluto is the planet with the lowest gravitational pull in the solar system. A day on Pluto is the equivalent of 6 days and 9 hours on Earth, which means that it has the second slowest speed of rotation in the solar system. Pluto moves around the Sun on a more diverse plane than the other 8 planets, passing further north and south of the celestial equator. Pluto's orbit is oval, which means that it can come closer to the Sun than Neptune, but then go almost 2 billion kilometers further away from Neptune's orbit. Pluto requires 248 years to make a complete cycle through the zodiac. Pluto spends 21 years in each sign. The placement of Pluto among the signs of the zodiac refers to generational qualities. Since the time of its discovery, Pluto still has 177 years to go until it has made a complete orbit around the Sun. So much of what we know of Pluto at this point is speculative. We only have 80 years, basically, of observation of Pluto, and Pluto moving through very limited signs in which we've been able to observe it. Therefore, our interpretations of Pluto are based on speculation, not long-term astrological observations like the lower octave planets. Now, another FYI, back in, I think it was 2008, Pluto was demoted by the international scientific community to being a dwarf planet. Nevertheless, in Hermetic astrology, we do feel that Pluto represents key psychological factors, and we continue to use that in our system. All right, Pluto in mythology. In Greco-Roman mythology, Pluto was the ruler of the underworld, which included both Hades and the Elysian fields. Sometimes the underworld could be referred to by the Greeks also as the land of the blessed. Legend holds that when the world was divided, Zeus took the heavens, Poseidon the oceans, and Hades the underworld. The symbols commonly associated with Pluto were the helmet of darkness, which rendered the bearer invisible, Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guarded the entrance to Hades, ensuring that those who entered could not leave. In ancient times, Pluto was referred to as the wealthy one, as most mineral wealth was extracted from his underground realm. In geology, the term Pluton refers to a mass of igneous rock that crystallized from magma while still below the surface of the Earth. If you want to see a Pluton drive through the Tijeras Pass, and this actually only applies to those of you in Albuquerque.
Unless you want to make a big one.
Unless you want to come out here, please come visit us. If you drive through the Tijeras Pass, where the Sandia Mountains are separated from the Manzanos, you will see the base of those mountains is giant granitic Pluton. And I forget the age, it's like 2 billion years old. It's really old rock back from, the early creation of the Earth. Persephone was seduced by Hades, or Pluto, with a pomegranate, no less, abducted and carried away to the underworld. Girls, watch out when someone offers you a pomegranate. Hades is the most commonly depicted in art through the abduction of Persephone. Hades was not only the Greek name for the god, but also his underground realm. The Greeks had concerns that those who did not receive a proper burial would return to haunt the living. Well, they're not the only culture group that believes that. This definitely spans across many different ethnicities. Once you entered Pluto's realm, you were not allowed to leave. Only Mercury, Hermes, who would guide souls to the underworld, and Persephone were allowed to leave. So we can see something in the mythological symbolism of Pluto that's going to impact us in terms of our psychological interpretation of Pluto. Pluto is an underworld figure. He is dark, chthonic, and functions in a way of situations of coercion. Once you get in, it's hard to untangle yourself. It's hard to get out. Now, in the soul, we say that Pluto governs the universal welfare urges. This implies a desire to feel connected to something greater than yourself. And prior to class, Vicki asked the question of how does one think about Pluto? That she thinks about Pluto in terms of relationships with groups and organizations. But Pluto, in its purest form, has to do with whenever we think about anything that is greater than ourselves. Pluto is to some degree awe-inspiring. And I actually read a newspaper article online yesterday, which basically talked to the issue of gossip and what type of news people are willing to spread. And it's our common thought that people usually want to, spread news about prurient interest and which celebrity's sleeping with whom. Because that's what we see on TV news. But the truth is, they were able to actually scientifically track this by tracking which news articles are forwarded online. And the majority of articles that received the greatest amount of forwards were actually things that were considered to be awe-inspiring articles. Things that made people stop and think. Quite often it had to do with scientific discoveries of some type. So that actually put me in a good mood for a portion to realize that this can actually be tracked now, and that is something that people want. So my answer to you, Vicki, in terms of what Pluto is that incredible need for us to feel part of something bigger and to feel inspired by it. It is our internal search to figure out where we fit into the cosmic scheme of things and what our function is in God's great plan. That's the purest part of the planet Pluto.
Is that like somebody has a calling or a passion in life? Would you say that could be Pluto? Or the meaning of someone's meaning of life or purpose in life?
I would say Pluto is a part of that. But the drives of Pluto, these universal welfare urges, which are that sense of, if I'm doing the right thing, the rest of creation is benefiting from the fact that I'm engaged in that process. What we might call a vocation, the Latin word for a calling, is tied in somewhat with Pluto. Now, this goes to the question asked over the internet earlier, is what are Pluto activities? The nature of Pluto, however, as we think about this concept of being awe-inspired and moving forward and finding our cosmic work, there's someone who said that it has to do with physics, but basically every action has a reaction. Some say of equal or lesser strength. But nevertheless, what also happens when we start to stimulate Pluto is we also attract experiences with compulsion, conformity, obsessions, and or group influences. One of the things that happens when one wants to change is usually the group is made uncomfortable by that. Zane says, where Pluto falls in your chart, that area of your life is somewhat subject to conformity. This is where we feel a need to try and fit in. Its positive trait is cooperation. Think of a choir with everyone singing off the same sheet of music. When you see something like the opening rituals for the Olympics, with all of the drummers and dancers and musicians and everyone working together as a group for this common artistic expression, that's a positive form of Pluto. The negative traits of Pluto are that Pluto attracts experiences of coercion. What's coercion?
When you're forced to do something.
Yes. You're forced to do something and it feels against your will, or it feels like you're being stretched to do something.
Do you think of Pluto as being somehow associated with spirituality?
Very much so.
Okay, because I always think of it as
It's universal welfare urges.
Yeah.
It's hard to get more spiritual than that. Because those are the urges. Spirituality is when we surpass self-centeredness. And when we are able to look at not only to our well-being, but to the well-being of the whole. That's the highest form of spirituality, which sometimes is self-sacrificing.
So, for example, in many native traditions or indigenous traditions, that they would be embodying those that believe, in like all our relations and who believe in the interconnectedness of all, and so consider in their ways the effects on all.
Yes, It can tend towards being a cultural experience. There are certain ethnicities, such as Native American societies, you find more prevalent in Latin American societies and in Asian cultures, this concept of working for the benefit of all. Whereas in Western culture, primarily European and North American, there is a stronger predilection towards wanting to do things out of individual genius, having independence or personal freedom, regardless of the impact on those around you. Now, the true path may function somewhere between the two extremes, but there are cultural inclinations towards this behavior to the extreme. I can remember over 20 years ago when I had a Japanese client come to me who had been a student of mine. And in the consultation with her, noticing that Uranus was very strong in her chart, I made the comment that in her later years, she was someone that might be considered eccentric. She pulled out her English to Japanese dictionary, asked me how it was spelled, thumbed through the pages, found the word, and broke out in tears.
Yeah.
Because the Japanese culture is a culture that prides itself on cohesion and homogeneity and the unity of culture, rather than being outside of or separate from the group. One functions within the group for the well-being of the group. That's a culture where one might see Pluto very active as a force. So, I don't know where I was going with that, but onto the symbolism of Pluto. This quote, excuse me, I'm losing my voice tonight. Not only the 1939 Nautical Almanac, from which the ephemerides makers obtain their astrological data, but other scientific works have adopted the symbol for Pluto. The Church of Light has been using. Van Nostrand Scientific Encyclopedia, copyright 1938, has this to say. The name Pluto was selected for the new planet, and the first two letters of the name, combined in the monogram form, are used as the symbol of the planet. The influence of the planet is either the highest or the lowest, if any, and tends to divide the qualities of the animal soul from those of the divine soul. Groups, each striving for supremacy. The symbol represents the cross of Earth below, which is significant of the materialistic trend of the planet's lower influence. Above is the lunar crescent of the soul, but it is not such a crescent as is used in forming the symbols of Mercury, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. These crescents, like that of the moon, are open. Yet, while this upper part of the symbol of Pluto is clearly a crescent, its union with the cross of matter is such as completely to close one side and make it also resemble an imperfect circle. Or to state it another way, the upper significance of the symbol is to portray the transition or change of the soul to a higher form of expression, which is more nearly than that of the circle of spirit. Pluto rules the spiritual body of man. This is from Ancient Masonry, where he discusses the origins of the astrological symbols. Universal welfare, we've covered these already, the influence of coercion. I was thinking earlier, when looking at that image, where Pluto and Chiron are almost of equal size, and they seem to be rotating around a mutual common axis. Pluto, of all the planets, is considered to be the most dualistic of the planets. And that's why I think this may be a binary planetary system, because Pluto is extreme in everything that it does. The metal plutonium is man-made derivative of uranium. That is not a bracelet. You do not want to wear this. Among the gemstones, or what we might call talismans, talismanic gems, Pluto rules anything made from clay, including opals. I kind of like the opals better. But
Clay pots are beautiful.
they are beautiful. And one could have a lovely piece of clay around their neck.
Might be
In color, Pluto's associated with black, which is the sum of all colors, or with those colors that are not detectable to the human eye, infrared and ultraviolet. These are light moving above the visual spectrum that we can see. He says the tone for Pluto is harmony. And the part of the body that Pluto rules is the pituitary. Well, I want to know, if the tone is harmony, why does Pluto create so much trouble?
It's striving.
Okay,
It's the
striving, so
material
thank you
plane.
for the reminder. Striving towards harmony. Now, alchemically speaking, and this is something we encountered in the last two classes, also on upper octaves, Uranus and Neptune. These upper octaves are associated with one of the septenary division of planets. Zane determined that Pluto was the upper octave of the moon being emotion and representing the family unit or the domestic urges. When that is expanded outward towards clan, towards tribe, towards nationality, towards the world as a whole, and then towards the universe, it becomes the universal welfare urges. So, in the process of alchemy, we look at Pluto as being one of the ores of alchemical silver. And Pluto directly corresponds to divisions of labor and specialization of parts, something which we're going to look at shortly here. Anyone know what that picture is of?
Oh, it's a lichen.
Thank you, a lichen. What are lichens? Does anyone know?
Colonies.
Plants.
They are colonies, thank you.
Oh.
But lichens are actually symbiotic relationships. Lichens appear in the most extreme areas. If you go out and go hiking, you're going to see lichen colonies forming on rocks which are in the process of decomposition. And lichens are one of the first forces that come into this process of erosion. But lichens can be a symbiotic relationship of either fungus and algae or fungus and bacteria growing together. So these two different species actually function together to create a life form. I was particularly fond of this one. Can anyone identify the celebrity in that?
Looks like Mickey.
Yeah, this is the Mickey Mouse lichen. I hope Disney isn't watching and slaps us with a lawsuit here.
That's funny.
Anyone know what those are?
Ants.
Ants. And these?
These.
All right. Ants and bees are known to work cooperatively for the welfare of the colony. They sacrifice themselves so that the remainder of the colony can live. They have divisions of labor, specialization of parts. Only certain members of the colony are allowed to reproduce. There are those that are considered, worker bees or drones. Each individual serves a function within the colony, and their well-being cannot be separate from the colony. Likewise, wolves find it more successful to hunt in packs. Wolves are wild dogs that are separated from a pack, generally do not survive long. If any of you are dog owners and you wonder why your dog follows you around like a shadow, well, genetically they're descended from wolves and they are pack animals. Humans also have learned to work cooperatively for the welfare of the community or against it in the form of mobs and gangs. Here you can see African women working cooperatively to pound millet. Or the Amish above doing a barn raising. There's a mob scene down here. I don't know if they're ready for a lynching or what. But also gangs form in society, which are like bands of wild dogs to some degree, in the sense of preying off the weak or helpless in society, just as wild wolves or hyenas do. So there is this mentality of banding together for good or for ill with Pluto. Zane says, thinking about the welfare of the group or against the welfare of the group brings into the life events which are drastic and which are in some manner connected with the enforcement of the group will. Distorted thinking about the welfare of some group or against such welfare is responsible for events brought about by racketeers and gangsters, by antagonistic ganging up against the individual, and for the negativeness and degree of sensitiveness which encourages invasion by other organisms, and which, when the intellectual thought cells are also discordant, invites hives, hay fever, and asthma. This is from Mental Alchemy. So, with a harmonious Pluto in your chart, you will tend towards cooperative effort. You are somebody who will search in your life for a sense of community. In a sense, you're looking for a sense of belonging. You will tend towards positive experiences with groups and innate awareness of your life purpose or a feeling of connectedness. These are positive Pluto experiences. When discordant, you have negative experiences with groups, experiences with compulsion and conformity, being asked to toe the party line or maintain the status quo. You can be prone to obsessions and or mob influences. So let's work on our vocabulary builders. For positive Pluto, think alliance building, collaboration, collective work, cooperation, communal or group effort, mutual assistance, partnership, solidarity, teamwork, universal welfare. Considering how spiritual Pluto is, I had a much easier time coming up with negative Pluto traits. I need help. Those of you out there, if you come up with any Positive Pluto vocabulary that wasn't on that list, write it in, send it to me, email it to me, Christopher@light.org, or anyone in this room that comes up with a vocabulary, write it down and turn it in. Let's expand that list. All right, negative Pluto traits. Bullying, coercion, compulsion, someone who is dastardly, deceitful, devious, dishonest, exploitative. Extortion, someone who is fixated, harassing, intimidating, manipulative, menacing, someone who is obsessed. An oppressor, ostracizing, possessed, scheming. Sequestrations or kidnappings are Pluto-type experiences. Someone who is sinister, sly, sneaky, tyrannical, uncooperative, or underhanded. Now, of course, these can also be when Pluto's tied into aspects with other planets, things such as someone who is exploitative or an oppressor or tyrannical. The sun could be involved. If somebody's manipulative, scheming, sly, or sneaky, it's possible that Saturn's involved. Compulsion, dastardly extortion, Mars might be tied into an experience with Pluto. But Pluto responds, being neutral, responds to the other planets. He is an aspect.
So it brings out the negative aspects if it's a negative aspect.
And it can bring out the positive.
If it's a negative aspect as well, it can bring out the positive.
Only if the individual is firmly ensconced in their alchemy.
What if Pluto is conjunct with Uranus? How does that play out?
That happened in the early 60s, I think around 62, 63. Pluto-Uranus was conjunct. So there's a whole group of people born at that time with Pluto-Uranus and Virgo in a conjunction. And they're kind of nutty, but we love them anyways. And that means that one's universal welfare urges are tied in with the individualistic urges of the soul, and there is a conflict there. Because the individualistic urges want what? Nothing more than to be an individual. And the Pluto thought cells want universal welfare or cooperation, the need to work with the group or a team. So those who, from that generation, who are successful are those who learn to find a balance between being genius and individualistic at times, and at other times being able to function cooperatively with others, to surrender that need to be unique and to recognize that, you know what, you can have an idea here and they're having the same idea on the other side of the world. It's not that unique. You know, the monkeys are eating yams on this island, and you know what? 2 days later, they're eating yams on the next island. You ain't that special. But you are. You are that special. And that's basically what that aspect teaches. So let's look at the occupations that might come through a Pluto person. They're kind of dark. A black marketeer, a bootlegger, a bully, CIA agent, civil rights activist, there's a good one, community organizer, coordinator, a counter-terrorist, crooks or detectives, an ecologist, somebody who's concerned about the whole community of life forms, embezzlers, extortionists, FBI agents. Again, the CIA agents, the detectives, the FBI agents, these are persons who are working behind the scenes, trying to get at the core of things. Gangsters, gang members, intimidators, investigative reporters, those who are getting behind the scenes to try and find things that might change society for the better, you know, exposing the exploiters. Kidnappers, labor organizers, who are looking to prevent their team members from being exploited by unscrupulous employers. Mobsters, organized crime, private investigators, racketeers. Do I have that somewhere? No. Marketeer, racketeer. Reformers, smugglers, social workers.
Would that be in there? Would other people, like welfare workers, be part of all of
Yes,
this? Okay.
you see the word welfare there. They're looking for the benefit of society.
Community workers.
Community workers.
Okay. I just had a thought, what about somebody who is, I don't even know if there's a name for it, who kind of gets together resources and provides access to people so they can access services? I don't know what you would
A
call
point
that.
person.
What?
A point person.
You know, sometimes there's so much...
A community resource director or
okay.
a research director, I think that would be called. Yes, that would very much be a Pluto activity.
So, creating access for and equity workers, for example, people like that, or what's that, affirmative action, those sort of programs.
Those are all Pluto because they are groups for one, and they're geared for the benefit of society. And quite often there are groups that work in civil rights and affirmative action that are basically trying to right injustices that have taken place in society over a 400 and more year history of behavior.
Union representatives, all of that.
Right there,
That would
at the
be.
bottom, union organizer.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I didn't realize that was that.
Yep. Labor organizer, union organizers,
Anyway,
anyone working,
groups.
again, cooperatively for the welfare of the group,
So if you
or cooperatively to undermine the group.
Well,
So
like
it-
political action committees.
Exactly, again.
So if you had a oh, it's gone. It's gone. Sorry.
All right, next screen. All right, the Pluto person, consciously or unconsciously, easily tunes in on the thoughts and energies being broadcast from the inner planes. This opens him to unusual sources of information and power. He is active, energetic, and resourceful, and tends to unite with others to accomplish a common purpose. His best quality is spirituality. His worst quality is inversion. He is never milk and water in what he does, and if occasion demands, does not hesitate to resort to violence. When the destructive side is dominant, all his resourcefulness and energy are turned against society. He then becomes the gangster and racketeer who unites with the others of his type to spread the subtle lies and prey upon humanity. The best and worst side of this planet are more vividly in contrast than those of any other. The thoughts ruled by it are called universal welfare thoughts. That comes from delineating the horoscope.
So scapegoating and sabotage would be all part of this too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, physical description. Average height, strong muscular body, deliberate but dynamic personality, capable of expressing much force. Let's look into a Pluto personality. This is the chart I've chosen, and I will tell you, it was really hard for me to find a Pluto chart. I looked through 100 charts of notable persons looking for a dominant Pluto. I found 3 out of all the charts I looked at. And in this chart, you will see with the astrodynes that Pluto is just 1/10 of an astrodyne below Uranus in the chart. So Pluto is actually the secondary influence. But knowing this woman's history, I thought I would use this chart because it really shows the drastic nature of Pluto. So, using my laser pointer and getting closer to the screen so I can see,
11.8.
11.8 or 11.7. 1/10 of an astrodyne power is the, or 1/10 of a percent. By astrodyne power, it's, let me look at my paperwork as I advise everyone else to do. By astrodyne power, Uranus is 62.17 and Pluto is 61.76, but it's only 1/10 of a percent of the power in the chart. So I'm using this chart as my Pluto example.
Does Neptune drain that opposition between Pluto and the Pluto Moon conjunct?
Let's look at the aspectarium.
Oh, yeah, there we got one.
What's the aspect you're looking at?
The Pluto Moon conjunction opposing Jupiter.
All right, and Neptune in this chart forms a sextile to the Moon.
But not to Pluto. Oh yeah, it has to Pluto.
Forms a sextile to Pluto and a trine to Jupiter. So it is a conciliatory factor. And when we talk about who this is, it'll be an interesting insight as to where she works with some of this energy.
Yeah, because that's got to be pretty hard to live with.
What, like for herself and for others?
That Pluto Moon conjunction.
For her own experience, you mean?
Well,
opposing Jupiter.
And my guess is
Her
because it's in the
thinking.
house of brothers and sisters, it could also be hard on one's siblings.
Yeah, and their own thoughts, you know. Probably be hard to.
You're always, with it in the, wherever your third house is activated, you're always present with those thoughts. You want them to be good ones. So Pluto, we can see here, in terms of being somewhat organized in our process, Pluto's in the third house of mental pursuits, one's personal thoughts, studies, relationships with brothers, sisters, extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, the neighbors, and one's short journeys, or just a few of the concepts governed by this house. The most prominent aspect that can be seen here, we see it immediately with the moon and the other aspects that Vicki pointed out. And again, it falls after Uranus. So Uranus is actually the strongest influence in this chart, but Pluto's definitely vying for power here. And I wanted to use this chart as an example that sometimes when we are analyzing charts, our own or others, I have a chart where I have 3 planets that are within very close power to one another. And these urges are constantly fighting to dominate your head, we might say. They're all trying to get up there and find equal opportunity and equal expression. So in the case of this individual, we have to consider Pluto as being a powerful signature of who she was. Uranus, most dominant, is right there on the ascendant, only 23 minutes of zodiacal longitude away from the ascendant. So much of the power of Uranus is based on the fact that this conjunction is the strongest of the aspects which are calculated by zodiacal longitude. We'll move forward. You can look at the aspectarium in your handouts. And if we look at it here, I was discussing the Uranus ascendant conjunction, 11.62 astrodynes. That is powerful. What might we say about her personality?
She's a little eccentric. Or, I don't know, is it discordant or?
Is she intense? Does she come across as an intense person?
Good.
She's creative. She would definitely be original, creative. It's harmonious. So it may, may,
Maybe there's a penetrating aspect of her personality too that really.
it's in Cancer.
Oh, okay.
So
So
it
that
had
it
to
would be
do
more
with
diffused, would it?
More it has her emotions and her kind of, Cancer, domestic.
What about being right on the
assimilated.
ascendant? How do you think that might affect one's nervous system?
Oh, she's off the charts, hyper.
Probably a
Out
little
there.
high strung.
Yeah.
This one's wound up like an old-fashioned alarm clock.
Right.
The spring can't get any tighter.
And that's from the emotions because of Cancer being on the
Being
ascendant.
in a water sign, yes,
Yeah.
emotional things will impact that. And in what ways might she express eccentricities?
Through her assimilation, right? Isn't that what Cancer, like
Her house.
But let's look at the house position rather than the sign.
Okay.
Because I'm a believer in astrology that the most important thing is the planets and the houses. Signs are a kind of a sub-influence. They give coloring, but truly the planet and where it falls in your chart shows the events and the activities even more. So Uranus in the first house, anyone dare to?
Well, with her physical body.
Physical body, personality, self-expression will all have something unconventional or unusual tied in with it. And also, we know with Pluto, it's due to the results of intense and possibly obsessive thinking.
Well, what, they're semi-square?
Let's take a look at the aspectarian. Pluto semi-squares, or the moon semi-squares Uranus. And Pluto semi-squares Uranus. So the nature of the semi-square,
Friction.
there, somewhere in the lesson, Sane also points out that the difference between squares and oppositions is usually the events they bring into our lives are these big one-of-a-kind problems. But semi-squares and sesqui squares are these little niggling, ongoing, daily issues that create, it's like grinding your teeth. It's this thing that's always just sort of going on. It's like the neighbor's loud music that they don't turn off. It's there, it's in the background, it's bothering you. It's not the car running into your front wall. So semi-squares are the little things going on all the time in your life. There's the most powerful aspect in the chart. Parallel of the Sun to Saturn. What's happening with this? Look at that. That's 12.52 astrodides.
Plus they're opposing, aren't they?
If we take a look here, 11 Pisces to 16 Virgo, I would say that's an opposition, and that opposition is worth 10.13 astrodides. That's the third most powerful aspect in her chart. What goes on when the Sun opposes? Well, let's talk about the parallel first. Basically, it intensifies the opposition. A planet that's in a hard aspect, when it's also in parallel, it's just cranking up the volume on the nature of that aspect, which is a separation compound between the power urges and the safety urges. Can be prone to some depression or feelings of unworthiness. Yet, Sun in the 10th house, how could you feel unworthy?
Yeah.
But you do. But why? But you do. There's this conflict going on here. It could be triggered by family. I find persons who have Saturn in the 4th house want to be the dutiful daughter or dutiful son who stays by the family, and they feel that there's this need to take care of family members somehow. Let's look for other aspects. The conjunction. of the moon to Pluto. That's a powerful Pluto influence here. There is a parallel of Pluto to the ascendant. So there's an intensity compound between the self, the ascendant, and Pluto, the universal welfare urges. So they're tied in to this need for self-expression, but again, not only is Pluto semi-square Uranus, but also semi-square the ascendant. Pluto conjuncts Mercury. No. What am I looking at here?
They're
Sorry,
opposing.
Pluto opposes Mercury. I carved it out there so I couldn't see it. 16 Leo to 21 Aquarius. It's kind of wide, so it's a weak opposition, but nevertheless, when planets are in opposition, what's happening? They're pulling in opposite directions, the intellectual urges and the universal welfare urges. And they're in houses of education. One's private thoughts, the third house, one's public expression, which is the ninth house. Thoughts which are going on behind the scenes internally may not be congruous with the thoughts that are being expressed publicly. Because with Mercury and Jupiter in Aquarius, what else is going on in this chart? Optimism. This is one's intellectual urges and their religious urges are combined, which creates a buoyant mental outlook sometimes. Because at other times, this is active. Am I worthy, am I not? But life is really quite wonderful.
Well, but it also they try.
But then why am I feeling so depressed?
Is this a manic depressive thing?
I don't know. I don't know her pathologies. Yes, a question?
Yeah, from the
The
audience.
peanut gallery?
Can you explain parallels again? Alice Marie would like to know.
Yes, Alice Marie. Sorry you missed that class, but if you hold on about 20 minutes, I'll explain them.
Okay.
Because that is tonight's class. Moving right along, Pluto forms a sextile to Neptune in the chart, which Vicky pointed out earlier as a conciliatory factor. When an opposition is broken up, when there's a planet that forms a trine to one end of the opposition and a sextile to the other. So Neptune is here, the planet of imagination and the utopian urges in the house of performance and self-expression and love and romance. This is the chart of Karen Carpenter.
Oh, wow.
Mostly we remember her as a singer who played with the duo called the Carpenters. She played with her brother Richard. Obviously in this chart there's a very strong connection here, strong cooperative connection with family. But she was actually an amazing drummer and oftentimes played with other performers as a drummer. That was her first love. But the public wanted her to be a vocalist and see her as a performer. She died February 4th, 1983 at age 32 of heart failure brought on by anorexia nervosa. That's the reason I chose this chart, because Pluto I like to compare to the mythological phoenix that burns itself up and then rises from the ashes. If Pluto is dominant in your chart, you are somebody who feels a compulsion to reinvent yourself all the time. or not all the time. It could be at key junctures in the course of your life where you just let go of everything and you start all over again. Pluto is prone towards obsessive behavior, and anorexia is an obsessive behavior, and we can see how this is tied into the first house. Pluto conjuncts the moon, which has to do with dietary matters, one's food consumption, one's nutrition. The moon is the co-ruler of the first house, where we have Cancer on the cusp. Uranus is in the first house, where we detected that there's some degree of anxiety. Well, it's anorexia nervosa. We see there's something else tied in here.
I want to ask a question about the water element then. So what could that mean? Could she naturally tend to accumulate water, and maybe there might have been some reasons to...
Yes, she started dieting. Why? The audience likes it when you're skinny. I mean, back, the role models that were, and still are prevalent for women, are the super thin. When you're a performer, there's, extra pressure on you, except I think now in the recent Academy Awards, Monique sort of threw that one off. But there is this pressure to be incredibly thin because the camera adds 10 pounds to you, sort of thing. So, in my case, it adds 50 pounds. Some other factors I found interesting. Sun-Saturn opposition. She lived with her parents until she was 26. In our culture, that's a little unusual. It's not unusual in many cultures around the world where unmarried daughters live with their parents until they're married or until they're old age to take care of them. But in U.S. culture, that might be considered a little delayed. When she did move, she and her brother bought adjoining apartment buildings in Downey called Close to You, and You've Only Just Begun. Apparently they are still titled that. So here you can see again this very close connection also in housing. The moon has to do with housing. All right, Alice Marie. Thank you for your patience. Let's talk about the parallel aspect. I've chosen the parallel for tonight's class because the parallel aspect is closest in nature to the quality of Pluto. The parallel aspect is powerful, and it is called an intensity aspect. It is measured differently than other aspects in that the hard aspects of astrology, which we have covered over the last few weeks, that is the conjunction, the semi-sextile, the semi-square, the sextile, the square, the sesqui-square, the inconjunct, the opposition, I think I've covered it, and the trine. How did I leave that out?
Best for last.
Your best for last, thank you. Are all what we call hard aspects, and they are calculated through the process of zodiacal longitude. We are measuring the degrees of planets between one another as they fall in this band around the Earth's equator. Parallels, however, are measured in a very different way, and because of this, some astrologers don't use them, and possibly for other reasons. But parallels are measured by the planet's position north or south of the celestial equator. We spoke earlier of Pluto as being extreme, and that Pluto hits the northernmost points and the southernmost points along the north-south declination of the equator. When planets are within the same degree of declination, either north of the equator, south of the equator, or north-south, we call them that they are in parallel. Unlike all the other aspects, which have orbs that range from 3 degrees to the smallest for a semisextile in a cadent house, to 15 degrees for a luminary, the sun or moon, in an angular house, parallels across the board, regardless of house position, have 1 degree orb of aspect. The symbol is sometimes a P, or 2 parallel lines, and sometimes 2 parallel lines with a bar between them, which indicates a contraparallel. This is the aspect formed when one planet is north of the equator, the other planet is south of the equator. But they can be anywhere and in any other aspect. They could be conjunct in parallel, they can be semisextile in parallel, they can be semi-square in parallel, they may not even be an aspect, and they can be parallel to one another. On the handouts, parallel aspects on the aspectarian fall below this angled line, which is grayed in. These aspects are aspects by declination. These aspects in this upper half, the upper right half, are aspects by zodiacal longitude. So, basically, we've just discussed this. But this is the only aspect not calculated by the degrees along the zodiac, which a planet falls. The other thing that's kind of hard is pinning down a parallel, because it is not as precise or as well-defined as a conjunction. A parallel is similar to a conjunction in terms of its power, and in terms of the fact that it is neutral. It has no inherent conditioning. It just amplifies the planets that are involved. The parallel signifies qualities and conditions that develop slowly and give gradual force to the things signified by the 2 planets. The way I like to describe a parallel in a chart is it is very similar to the amplifier on your stereo. And as you go and you slowly turn up the volume, it starts to amplify the sound. And that's what the parallel does in a chart, is it starts to slowly amplify the effect of any 2 planets as they interact with one another. Here's an example of how parallels are presented on a chart form. The column to the right here shows the sun at 7 south, 14 minutes, moon 19 north, 4 minutes, Mercury 16 south, 3, so on and so forth. Any 2 planets at the same degree, we could see a parallel. Here we have 2349 north for Pluto, 2343 north for Uranus. So we can see that there is a parallel aspect there. The sun, 7 south 14, Saturn, 7 north 24. This is a contraparallel, same degree, but the difference is south or north of the equator. Mercury at 16 south, Jupiter at 15 south. They are falling within 1 degree of one another when you start calculating the minutes. The ascendant, 23 north. Pluto, 23 north. Uranus, 23 north. So these parallels are amplifying that energy, which is also tied into the semi-square aspect between these planets. So you can see where the obsessiveness in thinking became connected to processes governing the physical body and created a compulsion, something which she was out of control with.
Did she also write music?
I believe she did.
But she's not noted for that.
But one would think that with this, she may have had a good lyrical ability.
Yeah.
In this case, music and performance may have helped,
Yeah.
but I also think it hindered. Because the needs that are tied in with performing, being a publicly visible character, were amplified by the need to present a particular physical appearance. So we might look to that. And the other thing is, again, we might expect that to be the conciliating factor, or even one's lovers might distract them from eating disorders. But generally, when you have that pathology, there's a concern about also appearing, perfect to your love interest. So this is a case where a conciliating factor may have provided some peace, some respite from the otherwise intense nature of the chart, but again, it may not have been strong enough to break the pattern that was going on because of the part of the anorexia being tied in with the appearance for performance and appearance for one's love interest. These are all the parallels that we have already discussed in order of their power. Again, the closer they are to perfect, the more powerful they are. Okay? We talked about this at the beginning of the program. Pluto spends 248 years passing through the zodiac, 21 years in each sign. That is truly a generation. So, the delineations that I'm drawing here come from Beginner's Horoscope Maker and Reader, written shortly after Pluto was discovered. And Zane was really efforting to come up with delineations for this new planet. With the universal welfare thought selves expressing from the I am attitude, cooperation should be sought in attaining constructive political leadership rather than in bureaucratic exploitation. Sounds good to me. So, 1822 to 1852, and he'll return to Aries in 2068. Well, I'm not going to be around. And for some reason tonight, I can't think of what happened over that 21-year period, that 20-year period, in terms of specifics.
The gold rush, 1849, the gold rush to California.
Yeah, that was in 1849.
It was Tammany Hall and all of that was
Much later.
much later.
But
Yeah.
what about Napoleon? Wasn't he around then?
Yes, but I think that was earlier. Again, I'll have to sit and This may be a class we do sometime, which is take the upper octaves and every week do a roundtable discussion, pull out history books or find timetables and look at that and compare that. Not just to this country, but what was happening in other countries. I mean, that would be a great exercise. Pluto's harmony is in Aries, where he is powerful and a catalyst for dramatic change. Pluto in Taurus, with the universal welfare thought cells expressing from the I have attitude, cooperation should be sought in attaining freedom from want for all, rather than in monopolizing wealth. Pluto was in Taurus from 1852 to 1883 and returns 2098 to 2129. Opposite his home sign of Scorpio, Pluto is at his detriment in Taurus. This sign lends to expressions for more materialistic instincts. With the universal welfare thought cells expressing from the I think attitude, cooperation should be sought in properly educating the public rather than in misleading it.
Is that when our textbooks were written?
1884 to 1914, yep. Yes. Textbooks from that time period are very interesting.
Well, they're very there's an attitude that's trying to be, that's being communicated.
Instilled, yeah.
A proper decorum.
One of those cautionary stories. And,
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of that.
Right, and in this country there was, still a lot of asserting superiority, and you'll find textbooks from that area speak very derogatively of Irish.
It was very nationalistic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
With the universal welfare thought cells expressing from the I feel attitude, cooperation should be sought in improving the home life of people rather than in submitting to mediumistic control.
Mm.
Let's see. Home decorating or spirit channeling tonight? Which will it be? Call Martha Stewart.
She's probably in session.
She's at the Ouija board right now, but Pluto was in Cancer from 1914 to 1938. These were some tumultuous years. Definitely the highs and the lows. With the universal welfare thought cells expressing from the I will attitude, cooperation should be sought in the proper rearing of children rather than in questionable amusements.
That's my generation.
Me too.
What are these questionable amusements, might I ask?
Well, there was
We're not telling.
Well, I always looked at the drug culture, the development of the drug culture as an entertainment.
Questionable, huh?
It was being used much longer than this, prior to 1938. But 1938 to 58, the movies, Technicolor, came in during this period of time.
So is it like hedonism? Are we talking about hedonistic?
In Technicolor.
In Technicolor.
But the questionable amusements, could he be meaning like being very hedonistic?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
In the movies, they made the big epics of the Bible a lot in those periods.
Right, and Gone with the Wind, and The Wizard of Oz, and these really big epic films. During those years, all of the Busby Berkeley, 42nd Street, and all of these big extravaganza films came out.
And those are questionable amusements?
Not to me, but obviously the author was questioning. He was probably home doing math.
How does he draw them, like, I can't understand the connection between child rearing and questionable amusements. It just doesn't
Well,
make
it's
sense.
fifth house.
Leo
He's
governs both
talking
children
about
and
fifth house.
entertainment.
Oh,
Television came out then also, right?
Yes.
What was it?
Television came out.
Oh. So you could have healthy amusements,
Yeah.
Yes, you could, but they
and
didn't.
you could have a really bad thing with children happening in that, couldn't you?
Yeah.
Children were starting to rebel then, weren't they? Or starting to, like, everything, you know, you have the,
Yep, it's
that
very,
type of household of
Yep.
what was seen on TV, and then
there was that undercurrent. There
Right.
was a different kind of,
rebel
Jekyll
without
Hyde
a cause,
child.
stuff
Yeah.
like that. They started, you know,
yeah, that's
wanting to
true.
rebel a little bit, so,
I think that came out in what, 54, 55?
yeah.
Mm.
So.
Yeah,
For the
it
town.
was
Had the
a
Patty Duke
But there was-
kind of surface thing.
Yeah. But there was a lot of
1930s.
censorship during that period too, where you were only allowed to present certain relationships.
separate beds.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So children probably weren't learning.
A kiss was
Really
fade to black. So
Constructive, yeah, exactly.
Oh, that was when they were doing that?
Mhm.
Pluto is exalted in the sign of Leo, where he expresses dramatic rebirth and renewal and questionable amusements.
Well, we all enjoy it.
With the universal welfare thought cells expressing from the I analyze attitude, cooperation should be sought in benefiting labor rather than in exploiting labor. I mean, these are all really healthy aphorisms that he's giving us here. 1958 to 1971. Trying to think of what was going on during those years. They were certainly my formative years.
With regards to labor? Well, the unions really were kind of enforced during that period of time, weren't they?
I think they were.
And the people, the masses were starting to benefit economically from.
There was a staunch middle class being built at that
Yeah.
time, and a lot of it was through unionized labor demanding certain benefits for workers and income.
Now, there was also the rebirth of cooperatives, at least I know in Australia there were, and there probably were here in this country. It's all part of that counterculture movement, you know, and people discovered developing cooperatives and things like that.
Certainly at the end of this, we called cooperatives communes. And,
Yeah. Well, that too, yeah.
and at the end of this period, the late 60s into the early 70s were definitely the heyday of the communal living in the United States.
Yeah, intentional community, all of that, yeah.
Division of labor. and-
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're milking the goats today, and I'm, hoeing the field.
Oh, and that was when women questioned their role in the home and rights to work and have gender roles, in home duties and things. There was a lot of that going on, where they wanted men to participate more in the home. So that'd be the.
I think so. Yeah, that certainly is housework. With the universal welfare thought cells expressing from the I balance attitude, cooperation should be sought in attaining justice for all, rather than defeating the aims of justice.
Is that the period?
Oops. 1971 to 1983.
Attaining justice for all. Yeah. That was happening then, right?
Well,
Yes,
cool.
at least in this country, the end of the Vietnam War happened around 73 or 74.
Right
74.
around that time.
In the Air Force, in the military, 1972, I think they started allowing women in equal service to men. Whereas before it was separate, and women had a place and a role, but they weren't really full military, and this is when they started.
Burning bras, and when we started hearing in the news more women wanting to gain equal, equal pay for equal, what?
Equal pay for equal work.
Somehow I thought it rhymed.
Oh, probably did.
Did Watergate, were there any big legal cases that happened during that period?
Just the impeachment that I remember.
Yeah, Watergate was what, 1974?
Yeah, something like that, I think. Be interesting to go study what was going on in the courts during that period of time.
Right,
To see
that
what
would be
kind of-
interesting.
Yeah.
What were the biggest changes? Again,
Right.
wherever Pluto is, really big upheavals and changes happen. And
Right.
here, I think a lot of the upheaval, although women's suffrage started in the early 19th century, it was around this time, that time when the women's movement,
Was starting
Really?
to demand
Right.
yes,
changes be made.
It wasn't the first Supreme Justice a woman at that period?
that's
Well, Reagan's,
Sandra Dee, or
Sandra Day O'Connor.
but Reagan came into office, what, in 84, 82, something like that?
This was afterwards.
So this, yeah.
Pluto's in harmony is in Libra, where he expresses with vacillation and uncertainty. With the universal welfare thought cells expressing from the I desire attitude, cooperation should be sought in scientific research rather than in exploiting those who dissipate. Well, that didn't happen. Well, maybe it did. But these were 1735 to 1747, and I'm not thinking clearly about what happened then, but 83 to 95 was what they called the me generation. What was going on was this incredible push towards, grab what one can for oneself.
Right. Well,
Though also, this was the period of the AIDS epidemic as well.
right.
The AIDS pandemic. was
Isn't that when all the
1980.
pharmaceuticals really took off?
Right.
Research was no longer done by grants. Pharmaceutical companies started doing research, and so they had
Sponsoring
vested
that.
interest in it and promoting their drugs once they created these bonds.
Yeah, that could definitely be very much tied into this period.
Yeah.
Pluto, the lord of the underworld, is considered to be at home in Scorpio, the sign of death, and the spirit world. Now, that whole decade for me was burying about 30 people a year
Wow.
from my peer group. With the universal welfare thought cells expressing from the IC attitude, cooperation should be sought to further the spread of facts rather than in exploiting the credulous. All right, 1995 to 2008. Have we?
I don't
We've been
think
exploited
we've
and we
achieved
don't know it.
Huh.
Still married to being credulous.
But I also see Pluto moving through Sagittarius as the rise of fundamentalism in religion, both Christian and Islamic,
Well, yeah, that's a good point.
where religion has been used as a way of coercing people. People are pulled more tightly into groups. Terrorist organizations are like gangs in a way, in the way that you're indoctrinated in and you're not allowed out, with threats of what will happen to your family members if you
Well, there's
leave.
fear mongering too, because there's a lot here in this country, a lot of fear mongering around all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think the polarization causes the people to become more fundamentalist,
Yeah.
the Christians and stuff, because I think they feel like they're being exploited or whatever, and so they're polarizing, and so they're becoming more, or they were becoming,
Defensive, aggressive,
and going back to their roots to try to dig in with their belief systems.
With the universal welfare thought cells expressing from the I-use attitude, cooperation should be sought in organizations beneficial to the public rather than those detrimental to it.
Oh, I've been seeing that.
2008 to 2024. Well, what are we seeing?
Where
The
we are.
bailout of corporations.
Yes.
Uranus is big, Capricorn is big business. We've seen bank failures, the big corporations, the big car industry, automotive industry failing, banks failing. And then organizations beneficial to the public, there's great conflict over the current push towards universal health care in this country, something that could greatly reform and change, and where there's a lot of fear as to what, not having tried it, what that will really spell when it does happen.
Will it be beneficial or will it be detrimental is
Yeah,
the question.
That's the question. One doesn't know until they do something. And so it's something for which we have no experience.
Well, we've got until 2024 to figure it out.
Yeah. How old will I be?
Are we looking
I might be in need of that healthcare then.
Are we looking at organisations intended to be beneficial, or that in actuality are, or does it cover the whole spectrum?
It covers all organizations.
Yeah.
And as Pluto constantly shows us, it's dualistic. It's those that are beneficial, and it's also those that work against the welfare.
Yeah, but what I'm talking about is those that intend to be beneficial. I mean, they may not end up being like what we just talked about with healthcare. The intention is to be beneficial.
Right.
So it would cover all of that, the whole spectrum. I'm just not sure.
Well, but
Yeah, I'm not actually not sure.
I think it can express in both ways.
Yeah.
And we'll
Yeah.
find out if it seems to be beneficial, but
Okay.
it might be detrimental. And then that can be,
The expression might swing.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
I mean, this is such a highly charged issue that certain congressmen are getting death threats from
Right.
the general public. It's pushing people's buttons into a mob-like mentality
Well,
around this.
yeah, and it's interesting that they pass all this regulation to try and control how much money a person can support, lobby, or can support a politician or a cause or whatever. Then they factionalize that and make smaller groups that go out that can contribute more money, and it's interesting how Pluto tries to get around everything.
And I think something was circulating a few months back where the Supreme Court made a decision to give corporations the right of a human being.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was a few months ago.
Pluto and Capricorn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're almost through this. Aquarius, with the universal thought cells expressing from the I know attitude, cooperation should be sought in humanitarian endeavors rather than in taking advantage of human weaknesses. That's coming up. 1778 to 1798. That was the early years of formation of this country. Most of the time we were at war with Britain
Really? Yeah.
during that time.
But there was a huge move to all over the world, wasn't there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, against Britain.
Well, not against Britain, but toward more humanitarian. The French. Well, when was the French Revolution?
Right
Right
around
about
that
that time,
time, in the
yeah.
1790s, I believe.
Yeah.
89? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, so what was going on? Aquarius, the sign of humanitarianism. Pluto's there, the mob, as in the case of the French Revolution or the Boston Tea Party. people are clamoring for, liberty, equality, and brotherhood, basically, during this period of time.
Well, Australia was established as a penal colony
Is
around
that
that
when-
time.
about that
I
time?
think so, if my numbers are right. That was when we established, and there was a
You couldn't send them to Georgia anymore, so they had to send them to Australia.
Yeah, this country rejected it,
Uh-huh.
and they had to find Australia, to do that. But it's interesting because in some ways it was pretty awful, and it was taking advantage of human weaknesses because there were people who were not necessarily criminals. As part of that whole issue of the Industrial Revolution.
You could have been poor on the streets of London.
Exactly, and
packed
just
up
one
on it.
little
You could have been
thing.
Irish, and you would have been
Exactly.
packed up and shipped to Australia.
But then there was something humanitarian that came out of that, but I don't know what year it was, in that they could earn their freedom and they could start to own land, and so they actually could make a
As long as they
life.
stayed in Australia.
Yeah. What's that?
As long as they stayed in Australia.
Well, there's no way. I mean, some of them did go back to England,
Uh-huh.
but I don't know whether that many could.
Yeah, it's an interesting form of colonization,
Mhm.
sending your prisoners.
But Australia became a great country. I mean, to me, it seems like it was a great
Yeah.
country. It's very
It's kind of.
humanitarian, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that a lot of that grew out of all of that
Yeah.
early experience, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pluto is at his fall in Aquarius, where he can be prone to political strong-arming. That was certainly happening in those days, of mob rule. With the universal welfare thought cells expressing from the I believe attitude, cooperation should be sought in alleviating human suffering rather than in placing people in bondage.
Oh, yeah.
1797 to 1823, these were just the beginnings of the abolitionist movement during that period of time. And 2043 to 2068, don't know if I'll get to see that.
I don't think you will.
Maybe for fun.
All right. Where in your chart Pluto falls, we say that that area of your life is subject to coercion or to conformity. These are areas where you are being expected to fit in, toe the party line. So this can also be where you experience cooperation or nepotism.
What's nepotism?
Nepotism is an example of that would be, we see it a lot here in New Mexico in the government, where certain people's cousins and uncles and sons and daughters are appointed to jobs, or the governor might appoint political favorites into, paid positions that didn't exist before and may not actually have a need. That's nepotism.
Yeah.
Like when movie stars get their whole family as an actor
Exactly.
because they can.
Uh-huh.
Even if they know that.
Nepotism.
That's nepotism.
Okay. Gotcha.
So could I ask, why is it primarily subject to the more negative or restrictive pole of Pluto to be applied to the house? You said it could also be about cooperation, but why the emphasis on the coercive?
I think because we feel that and we remember it more. Things that hurt, we remember better than things that work right, for the most part. Whatever house is occupied by Pluto is subject to inner plane influence, either for good or ill. In its activities will be found facilities for cooperation with others and for contacting groups of people. To the extent Pluto is afflicted, will undue pressure be brought to bear by others to compel such action as they desire relative to the things the house rules. The department of life ruled by the house occupied by Pluto is subject to coercion.
Would this be involving institutions like prisons and places of confinement?
When we get to the 12th house.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And I'm going to try and speed through this, so I'll limit the Q&A for the next 15 minutes, just so we can bring class to an end. With the universal welfare thought cells expressing through the personality, spiritual possibilities and the ability to cooperate are shown. Efforts to benefit all, rather than some group, will bring higher satisfaction. Second house, with the universal welfare thought cells expressing through possessions, that money may be gained or lost through groups and cooperation is shown. The effort for the whole group to benefit. Here's how I take this. Wherever Pluto is in your chart, you have intense transformation. If it's in the first house, your phoenix aptitude is going to be with your health. You may go through periods in your life where you have drastic health conditions that you rise up from. And as due process, there is a transformation that takes place. If it's in your second house, you could go through, your house could burn down, or you could go give away all your possessions and start over again. Something drastic in your life, leaving a marriage or a natural disaster, something else could liberate you from your material things. Third house, which we saw with Karen Carpenter, can bring about very intense, dramatic, or drastic thinking. I think for the remainder of the class, since you all have the notes from Beginner's Horoscope Maker and Reader in your printouts, I'm going to skip that and you can read that privately, and I'll give you my take on the planet through the houses. Pluto in the fourth house can be drastic situations in the home. Positively speaking, I find Pluto in the fourth house corresponds to persons who grow up in communal situations, or where they live close to extended family, where they have this sense of community that is built into their home, their living environment. But Pluto in the fourth house also means that you are subject to the coercion of your family. We don't do that. Our people aren't like that. That's the nature of Pluto in the fourth house, is creating that distinction. Pluto in the fifth house, this can be intensely spiritualizing love affairs that bring about transformation in your life, or situations where you fall in love, but you actually, the wool's being pulled over your eyes. You can't see what you're getting involved in. In terms of one's children, one may feel intensely compelled to their children. I find Pluto in the fifth house oftentimes makes for people who are manipulated by their children. The kids are actually in charge. Pluto in the sixth house. This position of Pluto makes one move towards work that is cooperative in nature, or where they want to work on a team or a crew, or in a collaborative environment. Nepotism may come about because people bring them into the workplace that want to work with them. One can work with social work or nonprofits or community organizations, or on things that work behind the scenes. Secret, CIA, FBI, those type of detective environments. Seventh house, compulsive relationships. This could be something as wild as an arranged marriage, or a marriage that one ends up in, not really quite knowing how it happened. Shotgun weddings. Or one may be looking for their soulmate with Pluto in the seventh house on a more positive vein, looking to find someone that they really connect with very deeply and on all levels, and they're looking for a relationship to be cooperative. in nature. But Pluto's position there sometimes creates power struggles in partnerships of any kind. Pluto in the 8th house, Zane spoke earlier about wherever Pluto's involved, we are somehow open to interplane influences. Well, and there isn't a place much stronger than when Pluto's in the 8th house. It's like somebody's going around with a satellite dish on them. That's just sort of open to and receiving impressions from the inner plane. And there isn't a way to discern from this other than through affliction or harmony, whether they're tuning into higher spiritual influences or whether it may be something more disruptive to them. Or Pluto, if it's highly afflicted in the 8th house, can create situations of psychic obsession, where one feels, dominated by spirits or obsessed by the thoughts of others. Worst case scenarios are persons who feel that they're being, afflicted by witchcraft or things like that. I find with Pluto in the 9th house, the desire is to not only engage in the institution, but transform the institution. The 9th house has to do with both academia and religion. And Pluto there can make certain education compulsory, but the person also wants to get in there and change or transform the institution, be it church or school, in which they're studying. In terms of international travel, you might want to be careful of places that are on the,
Terrorist list.
yeah, exactly. Or places that are going through, great social upheavals. With the universal welfare thought cells expressing through honor, credit, or discredit through cooperation or coercion is shown. Cooperation for spiritual welfare should be cultivated. I find Pluto in the 10th house indicates a person who is looking to be engaged in a career in which they are connected somehow to mass destiny. Whether it's through media, politics, some way in which they're through groups or organizations or humanitarian causes, or if it's highly afflicted, through secret groups, organizations, terrorist organizations, gangs, in which they can undermine society. 11th house of friendships, Pluto's position here very much draws one towards groups and very intense relationships with their friends, for which it can be all or nothing. They are either in your life as a friend, or then they're out of your life as a friend. Pluto really doesn't know any middle ground. It can also indicate where friends come into your life as a group. You may meet one person and their entire circle of friends that then becomes, an adjunct friendships for you. And in answer to your question, Samara, having to do with institutions, Pluto in the 12th house can bring one either into the institution to reform it, change it, make it better, or one could end up in conditions where they are coerced in institutions. I've known people who were actually placed in institutions by their spouses.
Who had Pluto in the 12th house?
I can't remember if that was there, but it represents that situation, that you can be sequestered,
Against your will.
against your will somehow. I mean, we read stories, the extremes are things like we see on the news of parents keeping a boy in the box in the basement for 28 years, you know, the enigma of Caspar Hauser sort of thing. And that's a real Pluto in the 12th house. It can also draw one into research, working behind the scenes, detective work of any kind, and or, you know, terrorist cells sort of activity on the dark side of Pluto.
Can be like that thing where old people, you know, might be coerced by family members to go to nursing homes because people can't do the caregiving or don't want to do the caregiving. It could
Or once in the nursing home, they may be fleeced out of their thousands and taken advantage of in some way. So, what else is on this screen? Oh, your exercise. Since you all can read and you all have that in your notes, work on it as part of your self-inquiry. Where Pluto falls in your chart is poignantly insightful. So look at the sign, house position, astrodynes, key aspects received to it, and evaluate the way in which it affects you. This will help Samara with the questions you asked is, you know, why do we see so much of the negative quality of Pluto if it's so darn spiritual? These inquiries are really important because that way you get to go in and see exactly where the good stuff comes in from Pluto in your chart, and also where you may feel like you have no control. I oftentimes look at Pluto as being those experiences in life, again, compulsion and conformity and coercion, where we feel like things happen to us and we're not the writer of that script.
So powerlessness.
There is some degree of powerlessness that's accompanied by that. Which, being the upper octave of the moon, and you can see that sort of passivity that can come with Pluto.
So despair.
It can lead to despair when you obsess.
But maybe it's that quest to find out the difference between self and others, and the group. You know, yourself within the group. Are you being benefited when you benefit the group? Or do you have the attitude that if you can't do what you want to do, then you know the others are against you? I mean, I can see where there's sort of a push-pull, spiritual, you know, being more spiritual to being concerned about self, and not knowing if being spiritual is in your own best interest, kind of a thing.
And I'll have to think about that, but I think you hit something of the perception that if I'm not allowed to do what I want to do, then you're either with me or you're against me, which is part of the drastic thinking of Pluto. All right, that is the end of this series, but here are the 5 classes coming up in April and May. There's going to be an overview of the Hermetic System of Progressions, April 15th. April 22nd, we will go into the focus on major progressions. The 29th on minor progressions. May 6th on transit progressions. And since there's not a lot to say about transit progressions, that'll be the time when we look at how progressions are reinforced. Majors, minors, transits, all coming together to spell out event in a chart. And then the last class is on the Alchemy of Progressions. What do you do when you see something coming up that you believe will be unfavorable? And how do you redirect that energy so it goes down constructive channels and actually create something in your life that you want to have happen? So that is what's coming up. I thank you all for your attendance all these 10 weeks, for whatever portion of them you've been here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's great, Christopher.
Any questions from the peanut gallery out there, or you want to identify anyone who's been in attendance?
Yeah, let's give them, remember it takes a couple of minutes before they'll hear you say it in the class.
If you're out there and have been part of these classes, but you've been silent on screen tonight, just log on and let us know you're out there. This is Christopher's magic mirror time.
Glenda from Colorado.
Hi, Glenda.
She has a lot of information about Karen Carpenter. She has a long thing. You want me to read it?
We probably don't have time for
Okay.
that.
All right.
But thank you for all your Karen Carpenter information. I will read that before using that chart again.
Michelle from Santa Cruz.
Hi, Michelle.
Alice Marie, San Diego.
We know you're here.
Renee, British Columbia.
Hi, Renee.
Dorothy, California.
Hi, Dorothy.
Janice Butler, Port Angeles, Washington.
Hey, Janice.
And of course, Mike Salter from England.
Hey, you hung in there. Good deal, Mike. Yes, also those of you out there, we're always looking to improve. So if you have any ideas on the classes, what worked well, what didn't, what worked well, please email me with that information, because that way we can better serve you in the future. All right, good night.
Thank you.